Well, greetings and welcome to week 18 of history. We are going to, for the next few lessons anyway, kind of bounce across the globe and get a snapshot point in time of where we are. Chronologically, we are getting close to the end of the first millennium. And just keep that in mind. We will kind of shift into another gear after the year 1000, and a few more things will become apparent. But right now, again, if you're looking at it sort of on a timeline, we are ending the first 1,000 years or so. But again, the authors of the book and of this curriculum, and I think this is a great idea. The focus again is on Western European history because that is our direct antecedent. That is where the lion's share of the United States, culturally, politically, legally, and otherwise, spawned from. But, of course, we do have lots of other cultures represented here as well, and it is very, very instructive to look at what is going on outside of Europe throughout history as just a fascinating means of how people develop. Again, the focus will be on Western Europe, but it is very, very important that we study India, New Zealand, China, Japan, and all these other places we have, the Mayan civilizations, to learn about the similarities, the differences, and really sort of expand our knowledge, not just how we behave, but how others behave, and how certain customs that are still observed today came to be. We're going to start off next week in China. The last time we talked about in China was the Tang Dynasty, Tang, about 600, 700 A.D., and some of the advances made there. You remember the Tang Dynasty included Wu Zetian, the first and still only female emperor of China. She was ruthless but very, very successful, and of course we're still talking about her today. The Tang Dynasty, as happens to the dynasties and other political movements elsewhere, sort of faded away. Again, in-party fighting, they lose a little control here, lose a little control there. The next thing you know, there's another dynasty that's calling the shots. The next golden age of China would come around the after the year 906 is when the Tang Dynasty sort of withered away. There were several other dynasties that began to exert some influence here and there, but none of them were terribly remarkable. There were, like 5 immediate Chinese emperors after the Tang Dynasty collapsed, and they were fairly unremarkable. There was a man finally, however, who was able to pull off and pull China more or less back together as a nation. His personal name was General Zhao Kejong. He stole the throne from a 7-year-old emperor and began the Song Dynasty in the year 960. He made Kaifeng the capital and went by the name of Emperor Taizu. The name is very familiar to Taizong. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This part of China saw, for the next couple of centuries, saw some interesting advancement. The first recorded instances of restaurants, places where you could go, eat, and leave, came about during the Song Dynasty in China. They were set up along trade routes, and again, it seems like such an elementary idea to us, but to that time, it was a novel idea. Hey, what if I build this structure, go there and cook, and people come and they give me money for the food? Seems like an elementary concept to us, but the first recorded instance of this being a thing in human history was during the 10th century and the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty lasted for about 300 plus years, which is a long time for any single entity to rule a region particularly as large and still as diverse as China. They decided to move their capital to a more secure location in Hangzhou, so you ended up with people referring to the Northern Song Dynasty and the Southern Song. It can get a little confusing. I'm not going to require you to remember that. One interesting thing that happened during the Song Dynasty was the sort of the rebirth or rediscovery of the teachings of Confucius. You remember him from the Tang Dynasty. Again, Confucius, obviously not a Christian, but a lot of his philosophies we will recognize being Christians. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, Matthew 23:29 says. Confucius says pretty much the same thing. Confucius believed, and this is another sort of thing that we think about as Christians, he believed that the poor were some of the most important people around and should be treated with respect and treated fairly. The poor were the ones that did the farming, which fed everyone, which made sure everyone didn't starve. Actually, the order of importance in Chinese hierarchy, the social hierarchy as it were, during the Song Dynasty and during a lot of their history, was very unique in that, the emperor was above all. After him, the Shi, S-H-I, the nobles, officials helped run the government. The poor peasant farmers, the Nong, were really third on the social ring. The Gong, the artist who enriched the people, were next, followed by the merchants, those who owned businesses and traded, sold goods and services. Below them were the soldiers, and below them were the slaves. Now, there was not widespread slavery in China, so really the lowest rung of their social ladder was the soldiers, which is odd because we certainly place a strong value on soldiers and the sacrifice one has to make to be military. So, as you can imagine, this system was very strange to Europeans when we first began learning about China and interacting with them. Again, in Europe, you could argue that knights of renown were second only to the nobles and the rulers. So this was kind of an upside-down social pecking order in China as compared to what they were used to in Europe. Lots of innovations happened during the Song Dynasty. The Chinese have always been a very curious people, very open to experimentation and really thinking outside the box. That continues to today. One of these was paper money, the idea that a note could be used as currency. Currency, of course, being what you use to, purchase something with, a good or a service. And, of course, it had always been, in every civilization, either a commodity, give me 2 sheep for 1 cow, or gold, some precious mineral that everyone values. So the idea of paper money, Europe didn't start using paper money until really the 1600s. So this was a Chinese innovation for the world, and the coins that they did have, they would cut square-shaped holes in them, so you could take a bunch of coins and put it on a string and literally wear your money around your neck like a necklace. There's a whole lot of examples from the Song Dynasty of coins with holes cut into them. The biggest innovation from China at this time was movable type. Now, in Western culture, we mark the inventing of the printing press as Johann Gutenberg in the 16th century, 1580 something, I believe. But China had movable type. It was the difference was it was not metal. The printing press that Gutenberg was made of metal figurines, letters, and was much sturdier. But the Chinese, during the Song Dynasty, invented movable type using hardened clay. Not as reliable, but again, several hundred years before Gutenberg invented the printing press, the Chinese had movable type. And of course, as you can imagine, much like it did in Western Europe when Gutenberg's invention really hit its stride, it forever changed the way people communicated. It allowed for the first bit of mass communication. For the first time in human history, you could take an idea, write it down, and mass produce hard copies to distribute to multiple people instead of having to share books or scrolls or whatever, instead of having to literally hand transcribe them, copy them one by one by one. You could now make multiple copies of it. So as you would expect after this, then the demand for literacy certainly surged after that. It makes no sense having a bunch of stuff to read if you don't have people who can read them. So you had this happen, and also, in addition to literacy soaring, overall baseline knowledge soared. I think we've used the example today of one of the reasons we have such an advantage in terms of knowledge over anyone else is not only the free flow, but the way we can share it. 200 years ago, if you got hurt and went to a doctor, you were relying on someone who was going to give you every bit of medical knowledge that they knew. In the 1900s, if you went to a doctor with a problem, if he had not experienced your particular problem, he could look up to his physician's desk reference, take out a book, and find somebody who had that just trove of knowledge, that wealth of information. China, in a very rudimentary way during the Song Dynasty, began to experience that. And of course, medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, chemical knowledge went way, way up very, very quickly. And Europe was way behind China in many respects. During the Song period, also new ways of explosive weapons. To create explosive weapons were explored. You remember under the Tang Dynasty, they were the ones that really created the fireworks. Under the Song Dynasty, that idea was concentrated into the first of what we now know to be gunpowder, a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that, when ignited, expanded very quickly, exploded, and the Chinese gunpowder was called Chinese snow by some of the people who witnessed it. And of course, as the power of gunpowder and its various derivatives were harnessed and perfected over the next few hundred years, it changed the world, changed warfare, and of course, by proxy, it was going to change the course of human existence. Another big innovation during the Song Dynasty was porcelain. They combined the elements that were required to create this very malleable and very sturdy. You know, we think of porcelain as being super breakable, but one of its strengths is it's a fairly sturdy surface. It accepts paint very well, and it's made from kind of a coal dust and a fine white clay. But if you heat it up and finish it, and we still have examples of porcelain from 1,000+ years ago in the Song Dynasty of China. Probably the most interesting, the most innovative was the gunpowder and the movable type, but maybe the most interesting advance during the Song Dynasty was the practice of acupuncture. And it's if you're familiar with it, it's the method of inserting tiny needles into the body at specific points to relieve pressure, pain, other symptoms. The wild thing is, here in the year 2022, people still practice acupuncture, but there is no generally agreed upon scientific definition for exactly how it works. But in many cases, it does work, and people use it. There are people that swear by it. I've never had it, but it's still considered an alternative medical treatment, but it's legit. So, it just amazes me that with all our knowledge today, there's still no one single perfect explanation as to how acupuncture works. But for many people, it does work. Another notable advance during the Song Dynasty, the discovery of the compass needle, and the fact that magnets face to the north. And no matter where you are on the planet, if you have a magnetic aligned in a cylindrical dial, it'll point north. And in terms of navigation, you can imagine what kind of advances this meant. This was also, again, as it was, a relatively peaceful era. Again, when you have peace and economic prosperity, what happens next? You get art, you get literature, you get the good stuff, the icing on the cake that makes life worth living. From the Song Dynasty, we have landscape paintings on silk, beautiful jade carvings, calligraphy, lettering, the decorative folding fans that are associated with the Orient. Yeah, that happened during the Song Dynasty. Very briefly mention one other innovation that happened during the Song Dynasty that was not so pleasant. I don't know how it happened, but somehow in Chinese culture, the idea of foot binding became popular. For whatever reason, a woman was considered beautiful if her feet were absolutely tiny. I don't know how to explain it in terms of a culture. So you would a baby girl's feet would be wrapped and bound tight enough to stop normal growth, and of course you could imagine as they got a little older, it was impossible to walk on them. So this was more of a rich person's pastime because poor Chinese could not afford to have a woman around that couldn't move. You know, the poor folk were going to have to move and do something. The rich could get away with it, but I can tell you this. I mean, I've been married for 22 years. When I was dating, I never looked at a woman and said, boy, her feet are too big. Again, I don't know how this came to be a measure of attractiveness, but it did. And the Song Dynasty, under the Song Dynasty, the custom of foot binding, which I understand is still practiced in some ways today, was practiced. So again, not all of the Song Dynasty was good, but you can certainly appreciate the just astounding number of advances that were made in China under the Song Dynasty, which lasted until about the year 1276. We'll talk more about that. Our next lesson takes us to Egypt and the Christian church in Egypt. A Christian church that still exists today, a Christian church that says, with some facts and some proof, to be the oldest Christian church on earth. It's called the Coptic Orthodox Church, sometimes known as the Egyptian Orthodox Church. Copt is a European version of the Arabic word for Egyptian, and this church was established right around the time the book of Acts was chronicling things. So it was one of the first churches established under this new little weird group of people called Christians, and the church is still around today. They claim that the Apostle Mark started their church. That is the same Mark who wrote the second book of the New Testament. Sometime between AD 42 and AD 62, that would have placed it around the reign of Nero. And the first century after the church was established, they were very influential. Christian Egyptians began to have cultural influence, and you will see the Egyptians moving away from mummification because as Christians we believe that these earthly bodies are not the ones we're going to be taking with us into the next life. So again, from a cultural standpoint, mummification and all of the ceremonies surrounding bodies in Egypt began to disappear. By the year 300 AD, the Coptic Church, by now also known as the Church of Alexandria, the main Egyptian city where it was based, was probably one of the strongest in the world. They broke away from both the Western Church and the Eastern Church. Again, the Byzantine Empire being the Eastern Church, the Papal States and such being the Western Church. They broke away from both because they felt that there were elements of those churches as they were set up that were incompatible with Christianity, or at least as they saw Christianity. By the late 500s, they were a fully independent Christian church, had no official ties to either the Eastern or Western Catholic churches. Although it was very strong then, it was about to face a big enemy in terms of Islam. 622, of course, when Muhammad began having his visions. 20 years later, the Arabs invaded Egypt with such ferocity that they almost obliterated the Coptic Church. By the year 744, thousands of Coptic Christians were compelled under threat of death to convert to Islam. There was a small but devout group of the Copts who held out against the Muslims and refused to convert. They kept the name and the identity Coptic Christians. And of course, as you can imagine, it was a struggle for them to maintain their faith in Christ while living in an Islamic nation where other religions were not looked upon with much kindness. Copts were predictably persecuted under the Islamic kings of Egypt, called the caliphs. The Coptic Orthodox Church is called by some the Church of the Martyrs for having so many people dying to defend the church. Now, the next story here has a whole lot of exaggeration in it, probably, but there's some kernel of truth in this story because of the circumstances. I'll let you decide. The year is 979. In Egypt, the Coptic Christian Church, of course, still very much persecuted by the Islamic majority and the Islamic rulers. The story goes that a caliph by the name of Moaz had an interest in debate. He was very intellectually curious, and he thought it would be entertaining, at least to hear a debate between a Christian and a Jew. So he put in his court together a debate with Christian stance, somebody arguing from the Jewish stance, and lots of anxious spectators, evidently. According to the Coptic Church, the debate heated up over a passage in Matthew which reads, "If you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." You probably remember that passage. Well, Moaz was intrigued by the words, and he decided to put them to a test. He issued a decree saying that Christians had 3 days to prove that scripture. All right, and if at the end of 3 days you either had to move a mountain, convert to Islam, leave Egypt, or be killed. Those were your 4 choices. Well, the Christians were a bit shaken, as you would understand by this. The Pope of the and again, they had their own Pope of the Coptic Church, asked for everyone to pray and fast and for God to make himself known. Now, here's where the story gets a little hazy. It's very difficult to determine exactly what happened next. The legend goes that a Christian tanner named Simeon, called Simon the Tanner for our purposes, had a reputation as being a good, faithful Christian who helped the needy and whatnot. The story goes as the crowds of the Coptic Church gathered at the base of this mountain called Makatan, an all-stone mountain. Simon the Tanner led them in prayer, and God answered. Now the question is, did the mountain move? Historical accounts vary, depends upon who you talk to. Something happened, though. How do we know that? Because the very next day, Caliph Moaz dropped his decree against the Coptic Christians and called for sort of an abatement of the persecution against them. Simon the Tanner is remembered in the Coptic Church for his faith. A church has been built in his honor at the base of that mountain, a church that still exists. And to this day, the Coptic Church in Egypt is still a vibrant church with about 9 million members. And, of course, Egypt is still under de facto Islamic rule. They're a little bit more secular than some nations, but still it's an Islamic nation. But the Coptic Christians are still there, and they are governed by a pope, 90 bishops worldwide. So this little, the little church that could, the Coptic Church of Egypt. Let's go back to Scandinavia now and throw a name at you that you've probably heard but don't know much about. Eric the Red. Again, much like some of the Viking gods you probably remember, Eric the Red was not a god. He was a real guy. But so many legends were built up around his journeys and his voyages that the name has stuck with everybody, even if they don't know exactly what the heck he did. He was born in Norway, and apparently his father had quite the temper. He was red-haired, so therefore Eric the Red. His father killed a man in an argument. The family had to leave Norway, and they chose Iceland because Vikings were just now beginning to populate Iceland. They discovered that most of the good land had already been taken, so they were sort of second-class citizens in Iceland. much like his father, Eric wound up in an argument with his neighbors and killed two people, not just one. So he was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. He couldn't go back to Norway because of his father's bad reputation there, so he decided to explore an island to the west that there had been rumors about. No one really knew it. Well, we call it Greenland today, and of course it's much larger than Iceland. I mean, it's 20. It's the largest island on Earth, and it was discovered by accident. A Viking sailor was blown off course in a storm, and he landed on this huge island and told everyone about it. Eric took 30 of his friends with him. He was apparently had built up a certain amount of influence to have that many people willing to follow him. Apparently he liked what he saw because he came back on a second voyage a few years later with 25 cargo ship loaded with 40 colonists per boat and lots of supplies. 14 ships made it safely. Some of them turned back in a storm and a couple of them sank. He renamed the island Greenland to make it sound like a fun place to live. Again, he was trying to recruit other people to come there. 95% of Greenland is absolutely uninhabitable. There are only a few coastal areas that have anything resembling arable land. But there was enough. There was enough to support a Viking civilization there. 85% of the island is, again, permanently covered with ice. There's the issue of limited sunshine because, again, it's so far north, but there are, southern Greenland, not a temperate climate, but you can survive. There were some natives that were already on Greenland, again, what we would call sort of cousins of the Native Americans, the Inuit Indians, the Saskatchewan Indians. Those were the natives there, and they disappeared. A couple of them disappeared about 3,000 years ago. The Inuits are still there, and there were some others that had migrated during the times of winter time when it was all ice up there. There was no such thing as ocean when it's that cold. There were several others. The Thules, Thule. The Thule is the actual name of the people. They were, again, related to the natives. So the Vikings were not the only ones that occupied Greenland. The Thule actually significant insofar as they created kayaks, the first known innovation of these types of canoes that were specifically built for Arctic climates. What happened to Eric the Red and the people? Well, after a lot of years of leadership, Eric the Red died in Greenland. Colony at one time reached as much as 10,000 people, but oddly enough, the people disappeared. And we don't really know what happened to them. We know they were there by the artifacts they left behind, including some great stories and poems called sagas. But some historians suspect just a freakish cold spell in the 1400s might have done away with them. It's a mystery that we still don't know today. Some things we're not going to know. Next week, we're going to talk about his son, Eric the Red's son, a fellow by the name of Leif Erikson, and how he went a little further west and discovered a whole new big old island. Anyway, we'll see you Monday.